My name is Kathy and Tan, and of course we have our invited artist, Wura, here. So what we're going to do now is just have a bit of a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then I will open up, or we will open up the discussion to the floor. So those of you, and I know there are a couple of you who have any questions or comments or just want to converse, or we can also get up and do some funk. That would also be cool. So you're very welcome to also be part of this discussion. Okay, so I kind of feel that I want to begin this like by giving you a big hug or something, but okay, I guess. okay, we'll cut the hug. And okay, so I have a whole list of questions here, and I guess I've been conversing with you, Wura, for a longer period of time now, roughly about 2 years, and I really do appreciate your work a lot, and you as a person. And every time I encounter you and your work, I'm always very deeply moved. But I thought I would, just kind of, have some also more formal questions for you. And so I'll begin with the first, which is fairly broad. I'll just, I have 2 copies here in case you want to follow. Yes. Okay, so dear Wura, your work, as we can see here in this exhibit, in your work, you work with drawings, with video and performance, and through each genre, you differently explore what constitutes intimacy, connection, and empathy between artist and audience, but also between the artwork and the viewer, and between body and the space that it occupies. And I think we saw that very clearly in the Kissing Mask this afternoon. So could you maybe speak a little bit more about how each genre works a little differently for you, particularly with regard to how a genre might create a sense of intimacy, but also a sense of critical distance that invites us as viewers to think about what I have called somewhere else the limits of empathy and identification. So basically how drawings, videos, and performances work a little differently for you with regards to intimacy and yet also critical distance.
Well, I mean, I think that the most, in terms of, like, when I think of the limits of intimacy, empathy, intimacy, and identification, I think most strongly about the Kissing Mask because it's a piece that really is about thinking about the artifact and our relationship to the artifact and this assumed intimacy that we often have with non-Western objects, African masks in particular, and the way they're and artifacts and the way they're displayed in museums. So that piece really came out of this. It was inspired by a drawing that Rubia Manze made, and she asked this question: "Who are you kissing when you kiss a mask?" And so I really got excited about that because I felt like it broke down this barrier between the performer, who usually wears the mask, and the object, and spoke to this sense of the mask being something that is used and alive in society as opposed to something that's behind glass. So the sense of it being this everyday experience that people have a relationship to. But in this case, I'm really creating a sense of distance with the audience, so you're invited to participate in this intimate act, but you're also, there's also a, I think you call it refusal, like there's a boundary that the mask and the performer maintain, even though people try to enter that space in various ways. And a kiss is something that's so, that allows for vulnerability, but the format kind of, it asks for vulnerability, but it also limits your presumed connection to this being and this body. In terms of these the mediums I work in, I think of I was just talking with someone about that this morning, about how drawing often feels like a very heady act for me, and it's something that I do alone in the studio, and it's very, it's bodily in a sense, but it's also very much about me being alone, whereas performance or other things that I do with my body are, even if it's something I'm doing alone, it's, there's a kind of like energy and interaction that's always happening, and often the performances feed the drawings because I'm thinking about, like when I'm running, I'm often thinking about like, oh, the body could do this, or what if I explode the body or twist the body? What would that look like on the page? So my own physicality brings imagery to the drawings for sure. And I hope that I think that they often evoke a kind of sensual experience in the viewer as well.
Yeah, thank you, definitely. I mean, and also just looking at your drawings that are, you know, in the space of this gallery right now. So, for instance, in this piece here, but you know, also several of them at the back and also here, you use various forms of hand stitching, of sewing, and embroidery. And I was just wondering, also within the framework, I think, of this exhibition, you know, thinking about intersectional feminisms, I was wondering how much of this use of stitching and sewing is a conscious decision to reappropriate an art form that has, in the history of Western but also non-Western cultures and art, often been ascribed as feminine, right? So in other words, you know, sewing or, you know, crochet or embroidery being a kind of feminine art form, or to put it differently, like, what is it that you have with thread, right? Like, what is it? and you can, yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. Tell us a little bit about your obsessions with thread.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with thread. I have this, like, I mean, I just love thread. I love the way it hangs, especially synthetic thread. It's like, it's so sensual, and it's just beautiful. I just love the beauty of it. But I don't think the work has any, I'm not really interested in that, in this sort of, the gendered. I don't think it's gendered at all. And I don't think that, I guess you would call it textile work. I don't think in most places of the world it's something that women do. I know in Nigeria, like, men do the embroidery, men do the weaving, men and women are tailors. So I think it's just this stupid thing we do where we're like, oh, it's like now we have the domestic, and you know, because I think like, I know that, like, my grandfather taught my mother how to sew and to repair things, and so I just think that I just don't relate to it at all. And I think that in the work, it's more like, I'm really interested in drawing, you know, and in how the thread is like this repetition and reiteration of the mark that I make, and that it also has this sense of, like, changing through that repetition or distorting, or I mean, one thing I like in my work is that you know, if I'm drawing figures, like, I'm really interested in drawing like black and brown people on the page almost exclusively, and any image that I'm working from, the person becomes like a brown person because I use brown thread, and I love that. Like, I draw something and then I stitch it, and it's like a world of black people. And I love the way the thread is, like, always transforming. And it's also filmic in a way too, because it's like every time, like, you can draw and I do often draw the same thing over and over again, but it's like changes slightly and it moves. And I think the thread has this really, it's just so pretty. And then you have, like, the reverse of the drawing, that's like the knots and the mistakes that are this other layer. But it's really about, like, I mean, it's just sort of like, I just love this thing, and then it's about drawing mostly.
Okay, could we maybe take some of those comments about thread and I think what you described as a transformation, right? And also its connections to beauty and aesthetics. So that seems to very much also fit in with this piece that actually I was also part of here. So If I Loved You, and maybe some of you were here last, when was it? October? Last year, September? Okay. When we did this. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that piece in which we were actually wrapping thread. So the performers, 11 or 12 in total, were actually wrapping thread around their faces and repeating the line, if I loved you, it was for your beauty. Now that you're no longer beautiful, I do not love you. So I still remember that. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about thread in performance in that piece?
Yeah, so that piece is called If I Loved You, and it's inspired by this Frida Kahlo painting, which is, the text is, if I loved you, it was for your hair. Now that you no longer have hair, I do not love you. And I just love this idea of like this tension between like, the beauty and destruction, and so in the piece the performers are wrapping thread around their faces and the face is getting distorted, and it's really kind of has this striking and kind of in a way like hideous sense, because you're transforming the way you usually look, but you're also as a performer going really internal, so you feel yourself not just by the way you're reflected physically, but you're kind of like, okay, this is my body and I'm feeling this change happen. So it's striking, but there's also something beautiful about this destruction, and sort of like I'm thinking about aging and the way the body changes, and what happens when we are the ones who are making the changes happen. And so it's like ugly, beautiful too, and then what is it with beauty anyway, and how that's always like a shifting paradigm, which I just find really interesting the way beauty functions as power and not, and even if it's if beauty is powerful, it's also sort of fleeting for people, and so. I like this idea of distorting the face and hiding the face and changing the face, and what happens, the freedom that you have when you obscure the face. And I think that's always been in my work since I started as an artist. Like I started making blurry self-portraits, and I was really interested in like what happens when you can see me but you can't see me. And
that relates back to the kissing mask as well. Right.
Yeah,
with
certainly. I mean,
obscuring.
And having an intimate act with a stranger is possible if you remove yourself from yourself in a way. And then it's kind of like you have this what's it called? Sort of like an ascendant kind of experience. Transcendent experience. Ascendant, is that when you're like levitating? Transcendent. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so, we talked a little bit about this over lunch. In 2015, I believe, you took part in a collective exhibit curated by Larry Osei-Mensah and Dexter Wimberly in New York City. So it was a collective exhibition. It wasn't a solo exhibition, and the title of the whole exhibition was called No Such Place: Contemporary African Artists in America. And and again, they're just, for me, like so many kind of references also to, recent books such as, Ghana Must Go, or like, the idea of like, so no such place like Africa. Because it's not a kind of homogeneous monolithic entity. So the title of the exhibition, No Such Place, referenced the statement by B.C. Sylvia, who's an independent curator and founder director of the Center for Contemporary Art in Lagos. And what she said was, there is no such thing as contemporary African art, there is only contemporary art from Africa. So there is no such thing as contemporary African art, there is only contemporary art in Africa. And I found that also a very striking statement to make. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the pieces that you had in that exhibition. and how for you, you felt, so why you chose them for this exhibition, and for you, how you felt they explored notions of cultural identity and history, both in a personal and a collective way.
Well, I mean, I think that to start with, like, Larry and Dexter wanted to do a show about contemporary African art, or contemporary art from Africa. African artists making work in the US. And so really, I just made drawings. And those pieces are, I mean, in a lot of my work, there's this relationship, like a relationship to the sea. There's a relationship to, because that space between the Americas and Africa, that sea, that Atlantic Ocean, is really a very formative landscape and structure and maybe architecture for a lot of the work I do. Just kind of that sense of expanse, and even like, I think a lot about the paper. The paper is like the sea to me. It's like this wide open expanse that's like full of history, but also is like, can be anything and that can change in any moment. So those two pieces, well, the pieces that they included in the show, one is called The Garden, and they're both about this sound man, who is a character that I wrote about many years ago, but is basically like, I was thinking about this character listening to the sea and recording the sea, and sort of like, it's like you're searching for some kind of like reason or answer about your life, and like it's in the sea. And so this character of Sound Man, who's also like a DJ that comes into some of the drawings, is like listening to the ocean for this thing, but you don't really know what they're listening for. And so so in the drawings that I made, there you have like the DJ on one side, and then you have this Ife head on the other side, and it's like they're like across this they're like relating across this expanse, and one is like the expanse of a garden, but it's sort of like things growing out of this mythical sea. And then the other is a large piece that's actually an image of Emeka Ogbo, who's a sound artist, but he's like the DJ in the drawing, and he's, I think it's called, I can't remember it now, I remember the title, talked about the title earlier, but I think it's called like, it's called Sound Man in the Sea, and it's like this Ife head, and then on the other side is Emeka, but he's like playing the ocean, you know, so it's like the ocean is like the LP, and then there's like a lotus flower in there, but he's like really listening to the ocean, and then the Ife head's on the other side. And but I think like going back to BC's comment, she's basically, I mean, we have this thing about like African, right? And she's basically always trying to explode that. And I think that it's like impossible to use that word. Like, I don't know why we use that word anymore. It's just like, it doesn't mean anything really. And so I think that, you know, she's trying to say it doesn't have meaning, but there's only, you know, you have to like look for what's happening and look in the places where the things that are happening. Mm-hmm. And for me, as someone who's Nigerian and American, I'm always, there's always this tension that, and exciting tension between these two places, and it often comes up in the drawings as like a spatial reality or architecture or a formal element in a lot of the work.
Yeah, I mean, what is striking about what you just said is the way in which you often pick up in your work on like the, how can we call it, the kind of the textures and the layers of space. I mean, I think, you know, like, so space is not, you know, simply, you know, something that just exists, you know, just like that, but like there are many different layers, and, you know, affective, you know, the affective dimension, the textual, the oral, you know, because you're talking about Emeka being a DJ and playing the sea, right? I find that really, really beautiful. Okay, so I have my next question refers to what you once said in an interview. So I'm going to quote yourself. I'm going to quote you. And you said once, quote, "I want people to stop, to witness, to comment on the work, or to ask questions because they feel drawn to it, pulled by it in a way that expands the imagination." Okay. Do you want me to read it again?
No.
Okay. Do you want to read it again yourself? Okay. So I'm just wondering, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how your experiences have been different in the various countries. So I know of at least 4, but of course there are many others. So Nigeria, the US, Germany, and the UK. I think you were in London, exhibiting in London recently. So how has your experience been different in the various countries that you have, in which you have shown and performed your work? Particularly with regard to its reception. So when you say you want people to stop, to witness, to comment, or to ask questions because they feel drawn to it or drawn by it, you know, how have people reacted differently in these different countries? Or have they not? Have they reacted in a similar way?
Well, I think that there are paradigms that we work from in various countries. I mean, in the US, it's like, race is such an overwhelmingly heavy and present way of thinking about everything. So it's sometimes, yeah, so that happens a lot in the US. But I think that as an artist, I mean, ideally we're trying to like get at something else that there's not language for yet, and we try to do that in, I mean, and that happens in any context. So if I'm making work in Nigeria, people are always trying to like figure out the language of something that they're looking at, and I am too, but I don't always know the language yet, and it's, you know, I want to tell people, well, I don't know, but let's not say that it's this that we know, because it's something we don't know yet, and that is, the language is kind of still landing on the thing. And I think it's very difficult for humans to make that happen. So, I mean, performance, for example, like when I'm in the US, I prefer to do performance for video, because I feel like it gets at the essence of what I'm trying to say, and audiences are so oversaturated with performance in the US, and you know, you're just like, I don't want to see this. I don't want to see another performance. It's horrible, you know. It's like, I just want to get on the subway and go on my way. And but in Lagos, I mean, I have the privilege of people are really kind of just human and interested, and they ask questions, and it's very energizing to perform in the street there, and to have this intimate experience with people in that performative sense. So, but I think even in Nigeria, I mean, I think as an artist, I'm always trying to like not think about anyone else when I'm creating, and preserve a kind of artistic integrity. Maybe sounds a little like formal, but like I'm really trying to like get into a headspace of making something that is, you know, like following that thing that's my own thing in my own language, maybe like that I laid out in my destiny before I was born, like, okay, you're gonna do these things, and you have to find these things, and you have to figure out your language. And so like, I think as artists, we're trying to like get there and like push it as much as possible before we die. And so I try to like not think of anything else and anybody else, and yet I'm, you know, of course informed by the place where I'm living, so like the smell of the place, or now we're in Harmattan season, so there's just dust everywhere, and like what does that mean to like the space? What does that mean to space? Or what does it mean to like the way that the human body moves? Or what does it mean to like not have blue sky? Oh, you guys have that same thing here too, but we have like, it's like glowing pink instead of like gray, and it's really hot. But so I'm just trying to figure out how, you know, all of that gets embedded in the work, and then yeah. So I don't know.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you're, like, you know, for this exhibition, you were here for the opening, and then so now you're here again. And do you want to talk a little bit about, how like your experience has been here in Berlin? Are you going to come back? We're not going to let you go, so actually you don't have to come back. You just stay.
I'll come back. Well, I mean, two things that were really amazing. One is I got to work with this group of performers when I arrived, and that was really incredible to just, because I performed in one of the pieces, but 3 of the pieces I didn't perform in, and so that was really beautiful to think about how a work sits on other bodies and how those other bodies and people move through the space and not just interpret, but like, what is the gesture? What is your own gesture of this gesture that I'm thinking of, or this question that I have? And that was super incredible and super beautiful to watch. And then today when I came back into the space, this is one thing I really love about drawings, and I don't know if anyone knows why this is, but like, and art too, like, you see something and you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then you come back like in 6 months or a year or whatever, and it's just like, oh my God, it's like the piece like grew, like kids, you're just like, oh my God, you're like a girl now, like you're not a baby anymore. And then it's like, you're a teenager, oh my God. So like, I just had this experience of like, when I made this piece, I remember it was like so many pieces. It was like 3, and then it became 6, and then I made it back to 2, and then I was like, I have to start this all over again, and I'm like getting rid of this. And then I put, the body back in, and I was like, I don't like this piece at all, And then like, I think like a week before I came here, I added this thread that I've been saving like for probably like 15 years. And then when I laid it out on the floor here with Eva, and she was like, I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna start weeping because she hates it, And I was just like, it's okay, just finish installing. It doesn't matter, you don't have to like everything you make, and some things are ugly anyway. And then she's like, I really like this piece. And I was still not sure about it. So anyway, when I came back today, I looked at it again, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. It just felt like it like had a different weight to it, And I feel like we do that to ourselves as humans, like we're like, well, I'm really like sometimes really punitive and like, oh, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you say that? And then like, I look back on it and I'm like, oh my God, you were so great a year ago. Look what you did and look what you said. Or like, someone sends me something and I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. And they're like, no, you said that. And I was like, I said that? That's amazing. Oh my God, I can't believe it. So there's something about like distance and time that I just find really, really lovely. And so to return to the show, which you don't always get to do, is like, really nice, like, because I feel like it's like you put something in and then you like catch up with it in the future, and then you're like, oh, there's something that this is going to teach me about this other thing. And I have to make a drawing for February for Cape Town, and I've been like working on it in Lagos. But then today when I arrived, I was like, oh, okay, I needed to come back and see this in order to like do that drawing, and I think that's so cool.
That's so great, Okay, I have one last question, and then we can open up the discussion to all of you. And I wanted to put this in because I also just wanted to make people aware of this incredible thing that you're going to be part of. So you'll be part of the curatorial team of the 33rd Biennale in Sao Paulo in Brazil at the end of this year. And the title of the show is Affective Infinities, so Infinidades Afectivas, Affective Infinities. And of course, when I read it, because in the piece that I wrote about the kissing mask, I was talking a lot about affect. And maybe you can speak a little bit about how the title, so Affective Infinities of the Sao Paulo Biennale, is something that you also think about in your work, so the role of affect, or maybe perhaps you could speak a little bit about how you yourself feel, so the transmission of affect between, you know, the work that you make and yourself, or the other way around, so, or the kind of continuous yeah, I guess, transferal of affect in the process of making or performing. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the curator, Gabriele Perez Madero, he is drawing this title, Affective Affinities, from the art critic and writer Mario Pedrosa, and who really believed in the power and integrity and creative vision of the artist. So the way Gabriele is structuring this biennial is that he's asking artists to be, it's not that we're like on a it's not like that we're on a curatorial team, even though that's the way they said it, but it's more like he's asking artists to curate sections of the biennial, so kind of like islands. Okay. And within those, we're working very independently, and the idea is that artists have these, I would say, like, we have like artistic ancestors and descendants and these connections that people don't often ask about. Mm-hmm. And that those things really drive the way we create work. So that we are, and the artists are all doing this in a very different way. Some are doing more like historical, kind of like traditional shows, and then others are doing, you know, working with like 10 Brazilian artists, and the work is the space will change over time. And for me, I was asked if I wanted to do a solo work or if I wanted to curate something. Mm-hmm. And so there's a group of artists that some I've worked with before and some I haven't. I'm working with a very small group, 5. And these were people who I was very interested in their work, and also I felt like there are connections between the work. And we are all, we're all making work it's about like relationships to space. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. So it's the actual architecture of the biennial site, so the building, and then and also thinking about the space of history and the space of the body, the relationship of the body to architecture. Mm-hmm. So I think this sense of like of affect and of like sensing something and mm-hmm. connecting to something mm-hmm. in a way that's very sensual, that you don't always have word language for yet, mm-hmm.
is
very critical, and that in order to like, for me to describe like the universe that I'm creating in, it's not like a catalog of artists from a certain place, mm-hmm. or a catalog of like what I think are the most important blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. It's really like, these people are asking certain kinds of questions in certain ways, and that's very exciting to me, mm-hmm. Because it's either in the vein of the way I make, or it's just totally different, or I totally disagree with like the way they're looking at something, but that's very exciting to me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's what's going to happen. We're all making, I wanted everyone to make new work, so it's all new commissions. And yeah, it's just
congratulations, cool. Wura. That's an amazing accomplishment. Yeah, so I think that was it from me. Maybe I'll have some more questions later on, but I'm sure that all of you, some of you, I know especially one of you has questions. So we're going to open up the floor to questions now, and I can pass this mic around. So if anyone has questions.
Thank you so much, Wura and Kathy, for a wonderfully engaging conversation. I wanted to maybe link the Eva, is that your name? Eva's sort of genealogical framing of black female artists to your work. And I want to ask you if you see yourself within that genealogy, and how you see yourself within that genealogy, and where do you see intersections between your work and some of the artists, or all of the artists, that Eva presented us with?
Well, I think that you know, when I should say, started making work, I was really, even now, like when I'm creating something, I think when we as artists are creating, it's like you look to people who, I mean, you look and you say, oh, I didn't even know that was possible. Like, that's possible, right? And so, I mean, I remember studying Adrian Piper a very long time ago and just thinking, oh my God, that's possible. You can do that, and you can ask that, and you can like do this thing with your body. And so I think that part of what's so amazing about these, oh, and Zora Neale Hurston, I mean, even before I thought I was going to become a performance artist, I was just like, I love myself when I'm laughing, and then again, when I'm looking mean and impressive. I had that on my wall in college, and I was just like, this woman is incredible, you know? And all her work around language, and me not even being able to hold those words in my mouth as I was reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, but just being like, this is so good, I just want to carry this book around. So I think there's this sense of, and I guess there's a sense of connection and also like a particular resonance as a Black woman in the US making work, and what that, and the kind of like invisibility and hypervisibility that's experienced. And then to perform is really about, I think, a kind of presence in the world, and a kind of, not, because you know that people aren't necessarily hearing or listening to you, you just have to do it for yourself, right? And just sort of like declare your space. And so I started as a photographer, and I did like a ton of like study and reading, and at some point I don't think I ever saw myself in a lineage with other Black women performance artists at all. I just think I just saw that these kinds of things were possible. And then, so when I started making, so I knew I could do something, and then I was like, okay, this is like a performative installation. And I also drew from certain like Yoruba traditions and kind of that I learned like through African American culture, but also like that I knew and trusted through my family and through sort of like more spiritual experiences. So all of that became part of my performance language. But I think one of the most important things was just about like the body. Like, you have a body, your body can do things that no other body can do. And that space, however personal and internal and intimate, is like hugely powerful. And to me, right, first of all. And then you see it, you're just like, oh, like, this is kind of amazing. And not only that, people are making work. I mean, they're making this work, and like, Grace Jones is sort of out there. Maybe she's not feeling lonely, but I think a lot of these women are like feeling lonely and like, what is going on? And like Adrian Piper in academia is like, okay, this is how I'm going to navigate this space. And I may be the only person for like 1,000,000 years, but I have to do this thing. And I think that kind of knowledge makes you realize that, wow, you're like connected to a lot of people. So, yeah.
Hey y'all, thank you. This is awesome. My question kind of revolves around, I guess, like place. So I lived in Houston for a while, and that's a sticky place, like literally, like. And for a while, I was listening to like screwed up music, and when I was in Houston, I realized like it's a perfect kind of form for that, like very hot, humid place. And so I was thinking, if you, and I haven't been to Austin, but it's hot there. And so the question is about heat, humidity, stickiness in relationship to how you're using thread. Like these kind of like junctures that can push and pull things together, but more so kind of like pulling things together, seeing the overlapping bodies on top of each other, that these kind of membranes. if that's like good. Yeah, thank you.
I love this question so much. I think that there's something really incredible about, I mean, I think when you say that, like, I think of like Nigeria and the fact that we don't always have power. And even if you have power, and even if you have money and you have like a service generator for your building and this and that, there are times when you don't have power and it's just really fucking hot, you know? It's like, and so actually that work that I made for Dexter's show, I remember like I lived with my friend Emma, and she didn't have AC, but she had fans, but we didn't always have electricity. And I remember there would be some times that I would be like, I was so hot and like, just like drenched. And I was like, fuck, I have to fucking finish these drawings. And I'm like dying here. Like I'm in like my underwear drawing, you know? But then I was just like, you just have to like go there. You know, you just have to like get into the drawing. And so it's like this amazing tension of like whatever's going on outside and our ability to just go and like make the world what we want it to be. And so I think that that's this incredible power that we have as creators to that, like that informs us, but it doesn't, it's more like it reminds us to really embrace that thing, or like follow that thing and catch that thing that's like, takes you out of your body because you're so hot, so you have to like leave your body or whatever, right? Or like you're, like some of the first drawings I made when I left Nigeria were these palm trees that I would see when I went running, and then connected to generators. And I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is like the beauty of this place. Like it's so totally futuristic and apocalyptic, and it's like one of the most beautiful and human places on the planet. And so I think that that tension is, I mean, you can either like fight it and be angry, or you can like transform it, and then you're just like, oh, I get it, right? So when I think of the heat of Texas, it's like, that's like no big deal because there's AC everywhere, you know? Think of the heat of Texas and you're like dying in your apartment at night. You know, it's like that's the thing, and you still have to like ascend, transcend. But I've always been really, I think there are a lot of Nigerians that live in Houston, of course, because of the oil and gas. But I also think there's something about that weather connection that's like so visceral that people are like, oh, I get it, you know? So, and it's like, yeah.
I have a question regarding your work process for your drawings. I thought it was really interesting when you talked about how often for you, performance is the first step, and then come the drawings. I actually would have guessed the other way around, so I thought that was really interesting. And I was wondering about your drawings, if they're a spontaneous act for you, or you have preconceived imagery and smaller scale, or how you create a large scale work like this one here.
Usually, I just, often but not lately, I just get an image and then I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I get that. I mean, often there's like this kind of tension this way that's happening between two figures or two things. But lately, I have been drawing smaller works, not like preparatory, but just like doing some smaller, I guess you might call them sketches, though I don't really like that word, but just like trying things out. And then I will sometimes cut the page and flip. So this piece is also a piece over there, and then there's also another piece that was the original piece. And then there's like another piece that was the first kind of tracing that I did. And that's, I think, the first time that I really started to think about these iterations. And I think my work is very filmic and photographic in the way that I compose in the space, but I started to think more about it, like the process is filmic, like just kind of like trying these different cells and adjusting them a little, and then what happens if the film strip gets flipped and, you know, it has this distortion, and so doing that with the paper itself. And I think I always felt like that was sort of like cheating, like you prepare something and then you draw it, and that sort of like kills the moment. But now it's more like, oh, there's like movement in this, and I like how things can get like cut out, and sometimes I cut holes in the paper. And so now it feels like, it's so ironic. It's like I'm really fast, but now like I'm fast at the making, but now the like visioning part is like taking like a lot longer. Like I'm like, oh, instead of just being like, oh, okay, I'm doing this on the page, it's more like, oh, but I want to try this, and what about this, and what about this, and it's just a funny thing. But the other thing is that I started running maybe like, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago now, or 5 years ago, and so that's really interesting to me too, because a lot of times when I run, I have like images come to me, and maybe because sometimes you're like kind of like losing your mind when you're running, and so you're just like things, you know, and so that's definitely part of what happens too on the page. Yeah. Thank you.